So we'll just start by diving right into it. If you were here for our writing and middle school history presentation, there's some of this that is certainly translatable across both from history to all other content areas. But today's focus is really going to be on the 4 core content areas. But if you represent an area like CTE or any of the fine arts, any of those areas that don't get touched upon in today's presentation, I would love to talk with you about this topic further. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll schedule a time to chat. So without any further ado, let's get started with an agenda for today. So just what we're looking to accomplish is to sort of attack those essential questions there on the left. And this is something that whether you are a division level specialist, department chair, or a classroom teacher who is a teacher leader and is the kind of person who wants to try to push instruction forward in your school, I hope that we equip you with some tools to do that today. Also, if you're of a mind to collaborate with a partner from across multiple content areas for some really awesome instruction, we hope that this will maybe both give you some ideas for that work, and then also at the very end show you some resources for addressing that. So the first area of literacy we're going to focus upon is vocabulary development, and this is something that especially in the time since I was a K-12 student, and depending upon how new you are to the profession, we might be in the same boat, but vocabulary best practice is very different than what I was used to as a student. And part of that is we know, and research supports the idea that the best vocabulary instruction is dynamic vocabulary instruction. Receiving a list of words with one definition meant to be memorized off of that list of definitions, we know is not the most effective way to study vocabulary. Research points to the fact that the more often words are encountered and in the more context they're encountered in, the more likely our students are able to develop their vocabulary. We also know, if you look at the second quote there in the left column, when children know a word, they not only know the word's definition and its logical relationship with other words, but they also know how the word functions in different contexts. You can't get there to that level of knowing a word when you're looking at vocabulary and just a simple list. That practice is reflected in the 2017 standards, where vocabulary is embedded in the passages that are available on the standards of learning tests. And that's the case because we know that to be best practice. Additionally, it's important to use a contextual approach to instruction to produce vocabulary gains. We know that is more effective than just simply learning word definitions, because it demonstrates to the student not only the meanings of a word, but also it gives them strategies to approach other words that they don't necessarily know the meaning to going in. So not only are you equipping them with content knowledge, you're equipping them with skills to acquire additional content knowledge on their own. And that's going to be sort of a common theme here throughout today's presentation, is the importance of not only content, but the skills that you can equip via specific content. And vocabulary is the primary one that we're focusing on. So just to sort of emphasize what I just spoke about, just consider 2 different types of vocabulary instruction, both the vocabulary list. This is sort of the type of vocabulary instruction that I received, and then also the power of tackling vocabulary in an organic way. One thing that the vocabulary list implies to students, or can imply to students, is that there's a hierarchy of meanings that is fixed. And we'll go over some examples of that here in just a minute, both within content areas and outside of specific content areas. But we know as readers that is not the way that vocabulary works, but the vocabulary list can either intentionally or unintentionally imply that to students, which can be problematic. It also implies that context doesn't matter, that words are not affected by context necessarily, and that the meaning of the word is the meaning of the word, and that's it. And then, of course, that also points out that the meaning of a word transcends content area, and that the meaning as it's presented in that list is the end-all, be-all, the most important thing. But now if you switch gears and think about tackling vocabulary in a more organic way, not only are students unpacking and learning a word, but in doing so, they're receiving a skill, a model strategy for doing that work on their own as they go forward. It also stresses the importance of paying attention to context in determining the definition of a word. Even if a student already knows the definition of a word while they're reading a passage, context can still impact the way the meaning of that word is presented. So it's really important to do that, and you can't get there with just using this vocabulary list method. And then finally, tackling vocabulary organically can help you emphasize content-specific information. We're going to look at some examples of that going forward, but I'm going to ask you to think about even just simple words that have a very specific meaning within your content area that might be very different across other content areas, and then consider just the general day of your student. They're not spending the entire day in one content area. They're moving from one to another, and they might be encountering the same important vocabulary term in two different classes back to back, and that word might have very different meanings. So modeling for them that context is important, content-specific information is important, is certainly best practice, and it's something that will help you create these sorts of interdisciplinary learning opportunities for students. So because it's almost spring training time, and so I would give an example outside of content areas, if you'll indulge me for just a bit, I'm going to use a baseball example. So in my teaching position in middle school that I had for like a decade, one of the coolest things that we did is we took a field trip to a minor league baseball game every year. There was a daytime game that was intended just for students. And as a baseball fan, I was sitting there watching, and a student overheard me express concern that the pitcher for the Richmond Flying Squirrels had walked a guy, saying something to the effect of, "I can't believe he just walked him." So as a baseball fan, the term walk is something that's part of my vocabulary. And when I'm sitting in a baseball stadium, the word walk means a very specific thing. But for the student sitting next to me who overheard me say that and asked, "What do you mean walked him?" He immediately went to like walking the dog, because he was responsible for walking his dog every morning. And he thought the image of the pitcher grabbing the batter by the hand and leading him around the bases was hilarious. So to me, in addition to being funny and entertaining as a baseball fan, it also pointed out this idea that what we think may be very intuitive vocabulary is not always very intuitive. Not just because a student has never encountered it before, but because a student might have a very different understanding of the meaning of that word. When I used the term walk at that baseball game, it meant something very specific to me and something very different to the student sitting next to me, which was also very different than what you see here in this definition that I've screenshotted off the internet. So being very intentional and very aware and very conscious of the words that you're encountering in your content area in a day-to-day basis becomes a really great opportunity for teaching vocabulary skills within your content area. And you're not only teaching those vocabulary skills within your content area, but you're teaching your content, because they're developing a better understanding of what the word means for you, which should allow them to master your content and your skills. But you're also equipping them with this transferable vocabulary skill that will serve them extremely well across all of their content areas. So here's another example that fits in with two different content areas. So think about a ninth grade student who, for their first period class, goes to their world history to 1500 class and learns about culture and this idea of beliefs, behaviors, objects, and other characteristics common to the members of a particular group or society. And that's the first time they've encountered that word culture. And and they're interested in it. They spend the entire class learning about it. And now culture in their mind means this thing. And then they go to their biology class and it's lab time, and they're asked to produce a culture. And all of a sudden there's this tension for that student. And it's important as instructors of all content areas to do the best we can to anticipate that sort of tension. So if a student approaches you with a question like, culture, well, we just learned about that in world history and it meant this, that's an important learning opportunity for those students. So instead of just saying, well, in this class it means this, and you shut it down just by giving them this static definition, instead using that as an opportunity to ask them how they've seen that word used before. Ask them to think about the definition that they encountered in their world history class, and now the definition that they're encountering in their biology class, and trying to connect those two, and think about why this one word might mean these two very different things across these two content areas. Having them attack that final question there: how does the meaning you learned in history relate to the meaning in science? Equips them with valuable vocabulary recognition skills, and also allows them to approach your content area and the skills in your content area with more fluency. So because literacy is about a multi-pronged integrated approach to teaching, it's also important that we discuss writing as part of this as well. Because writing is something that is, even though it is assessed as EOC English writing, writing is something for which we are all responsible. And it's a practice, it's a skill that, if you think about the sort of coursework you might have done in college, or if you think about previous jobs you may have had, writing is a skill that transcends all content areas and all fields. And if you can equip students with that skill, and with the knowledge that skill varies depending upon audience, varies depending upon content area, then you're equipping all your students with success, not just those who are going to be asked to write in a blue book on a college essay test, but those students who are going straight to the workplace or to the military, who are going to be asked to complete very different types of writing than sort of the standard 5-paragraph essay. So it's really important to think about what writing means in your content area when teaching writing for your specific discipline. So let's talk about the difference really quickly between assigning writing and teaching writing. It can be quite easy to assign writing. You give students a topic and say, write about this. And while that is effective in increasing the amount of time that students are spending writing, they may not have the sort of background knowledge or the skill development they need to be successful at that task. But also, that's not writing that is necessarily going to be authentic and specific to your discipline or to your content area. Additionally, assigned writing is often rooted in, you only rewrite to correct errors in usage and mechanics, and you never go back to review your thought processes or the actual content of your writing. So when we think about teaching writing, we're talking about writing not only writing in an authentic way, but writing that is instructed for. So when you teach writing, and this is not just the responsibility of the English teacher, this is the responsibility of all of us. It's important that the teacher model what it means to write for that task and or for that content area. Writing in a history class, writing as a historian, is one very specific set of skills, and writing as a scientist is a related set of skills, but may require different methods and different approaches. And if you assume that students are learning to write in English class, I don't need to spend my time teaching them how to write a lab report as a science teacher, or I don't need to spend my time teaching them to write a logic puzzle as a math teacher, then you're probably making an assumption that that will prove to be problematic, because we know that writing varies a great deal in different content areas, and it's important to model what that looks like. And I would suggest too that modeling is just that, modeling, allowing students to see you as a teacher work through the writing process on your own and asking questions about writing can be a great first step for those teachers who feel like they've never really taught writing before, or maybe they don't really know what teaching writing looks like or what it is, because maybe they just picked it up as they went, or maybe they just don't really remember ever being taught how to write. And then it's also important to note that final section of text there. When we teach writing, it is a recursive process. That is all over the 2017 English standards. This idea that you use models and strategies to write and then adjust based upon feedback, and to write and revise and write and revise before finally putting something out into the world. That's a much more authentic writing practice than writing something once, skimming it for usage in mechanics, and then sending it out into the world. So again, back to that idea of modeling. When writing is taught, this is what I mean by teachers modeling writing. You write with students. You allow them to see you struggle with your writing. Writing is difficult work. Finding the right word, finding the right sentence, allowing students to see that process happening is really important, because that is not something that is necessarily going to be intuitive for a student who's only beginning to really learn the craft of writing. And again, modeling is something that can be very simple, thinking aloud through the revision of your own writing, and then editing after you've gone back and revised for those larger ideas. So again, if we're thinking about some of those differences between assigning writing and teaching writing, the best writing instruction is integrated with content, not divorced from it. So if you're using writing only as a direct replacement for multiple choice assessment, that's good. That's certainly better than no writing at all. But this is the kind of writing that you can often just be assigned. If students are just filling in the blank, then that is writing that can just be assigned. That's typically a skill that students are familiar with by the time they get to the secondary level. And it doesn't necessarily require any sort of extra instruction. But it's also much less authentic because there are no links to any sort of source materials. And I mentioned source materials because that is the kind of thing that varies a great deal across content. In history class, maybe it's a political cartoon. In science class, maybe it's lab data or observation data. In math class, maybe you're writing just to explain your process or in your approach to a word problem or to an engineering issue. That is writing that is linked to source material. But if writing is devoid of any sort of impetus, then it's tough to label that as authentic writing. It's not the kind of writing that we encounter either at the next level academically or in the workplace. So writing to generate analytical responses to course content is the type of writing that you must teach, and it is authentic writing. Not only does it integrate all of the English SOL strands, because you'll be asking students to research, you'll be asking students to communicate, asking them to read, and asking them to write, but it increases the amount of time that the students spend writing, but also analyzing information. So not only are you giving students practice with the skill of writing, but you're also asking them to spend additional time puzzling over your content while they're creating that writing. So for a teacher who says, I don't have time to do that, yes, if you're simply assigning writing, it might be taking additional time from your instruction. But if you're embedding writing instruction into the work that you're doing, you'll be asking students to be spending that extra time with your content and effectively not costing yourself any instructional time because you're embedding these two skills together. And again, when they're doing this, this is a skill that is transferable. Not just across academic disciplines, but across contexts, be it, again, higher education, the workplace, what have you. But again, it's important to remember that you can't just assign this type of writing to students and expect that it's going to go perfectly and that all students will be at the same level and all students will be able to access it because they've acquired that knowledge in their English class. If this is something that's very specific to your discipline, it will need instruction. And then finally, if thinking school-wide or division-wide, Writing instruction is effective when it's embedded and expected across all content areas. Writing is not a skill that is unique to English. Every content area has a type of writing, a style of writing that may feel like the domain or of your content area or something that's unique to your content area. So just asking yourself as an instructor, how can students learn to write like a historian, a scientist, or a mathematician? How can student writing be generated as a response to the type of information and the type of sources that they're going to be encountering in your class on a daily basis? If you know that a specific unit is going to have students encountering a bunch of primary source material, well, thinking about, okay, how can we work on writing in response to primary source material throughout the course of this unit? If you know that your math unit is going to lead to lots of different types of word problems, and you want to emphasize the process of solving those problems, thinking about, okay, how can I teach my students to approach this writing process for this sort of work is going to be really important. And that's just, again, that's a question to ask yourself while you're planning, so that you know that when you have opportunities to teach literacy in this way in your content area classroom, you're taking advantage of those opportunities. So across all content areas, all of the core content areas we're talking about today, there are essential understandings or notes embedded in the standards that demand work with literacy. So in English here, the essential understandings for writing, I think it's obviously going to be a given for most of us that literacy instruction is important for English. But where else does it fit? Obviously, in history and social science, these are the point one skills that we talk about, the essential understandings that are skill-based for history and social science. I'm not going to read this list to you, but each of them is impossible without specific attention being paid to literacy, whether it's in interpreting vocabulary terms that students are going to encounter in sources that are using archaic language, or whether it's writing to demonstrate that you can interpret a primary source or interpret a map or a chart or a graph. All these history and social science essential understandings, it's impossible to approach them effectively without keeping literacy on the front of your mind. And some of those vocabulary skills and writing skills that we discussed earlier are going to be really important for helping you do that. In science, the science standards and their standards of learning goals, I've pasted a whole excerpt for you, but I've bolded two very specific sections where I think it's hard to look at those and to read those. And again, I'm not going to read those to you, but it's hard to look at those and not see how important literacy is. Even so that second bullet point there, the one in the middle, possessing significant knowledge of science to be informed consumers with the ability to communicate and use science in their everyday lives and engage in public discussions. So possessing significant knowledge of science, that's content area, that's content specific. But the rest of that is a skill that is part and parcel to literacy, both in terms of writing and reading. So no matter what you are teaching, there are standards that point to the importance of literacy. So if you encounter a resistant staff member who says, I'm a earth science teacher, it's not my job to teach writing. Well, the standards say that it is, and this is where it says that. And I haven't forgotten about math. There's a math essential understanding section for mathematical communication, asking students to communicate thinking and reasoning using the language of mathematics. And just that three-letter term there, the language of mathematics, I think kind of drives home everything I was saying about vocabulary. There is a language of mathematics. And not only do students encounter that language and learn that language through, like, here are a list of the terms we're going to encounter this chapter, but it's hard to demonstrate any sort of understanding of them or practice any sort of mastery of those terms until they encounter those practices while working through problems. And this mathematical communication essential understanding basically demands that when we're thinking about math instruction, we're still thinking about it with an eye toward literacy and toward communication. All right, so what I think is one sort of catch-all universal way to approach an emphasis upon literacy in your core content areas is to think about ways to use local topics. This is something that, as someone with a history background, I love the idea of schools using local history, because there isn't a local history course that's offered as part of the Virginia History and Social Science programming. So the question then becomes, how do students get that local history? How are they exposed to those local history topics? But it's not just history. Local science, thinking about earth science specifically, we have a set of standards for the entire state, but what earth science looks like out of a classroom window is going to vary tremendously as you move from Lee County to Accomack County. So incorporating local topics both to spur engagement and to give a more rich and full understanding of the standards is really important. That it also is a great way to encourage specific instruction around literacy is sort of icing on the cake. So here's an example from our science coordinator, Dr. Ann Peterson, whose contact information will be available at the end of this presentation if you want to reach out concerning science topics specifically. But this What is a Watershed project is something that she does both with teachers, thinking about how can we think of these issues around science and think about them locally. So effectively, students develop those bigger sort of essential understandings, processes, and content areas, those things that are embedded in the standards, through looking at a model of a watershed. I'm not going to, again, read that whole assignment to you, but we're basically thinking about watershed using a white paper, a shallow pan, and markers. So once they've developed those larger content area understandings and encountered the specific vocabulary like runoff and watershed, once they've encountered drainage, tributaries, once they've encountered those terms in a controlled setting, you're then equipping them to use those terms by going out into the community and apply what they've learned about watersheds to their locality. This is a picture of Peak Creek in my hometown of Pulaski County. But thinking about taking these specific classroom skills out into a local environment not only gives students practice with that and makes these sorts of lab skills incredibly engaging because they're out in their community doing these skills, but it also gives them practice in lots of different contexts using these words. So not only are they encountering the words in the classroom setting, they're taking those words to lab work out in the field, their locality, and then taking that next step from a literacy perspective and not just having the instruction end when the field experience is over, but then asking them to take what they found, bring it back to the classroom, and synthesize a response. If students encounter something while examining their local watershed that gives them alarm, take advantage of that interest and take advantage of that alarm and think about what they can do to spur action. And that's a great opportunity to incorporate writing. And then once again, they're using all those vocabulary terms they've encountered now 2 separate occasions. They're using those terms in their communications to the outside world. So we've taken what could have been just a simple in-classroom one class period lab. We've taken it into the community. And then once they've done that work in the community, they're communicating what they're finding to the outside world, to the community at large. And that means 3 separate opportunities to practice vocabulary and 3 separate opportunities to practice not only science skills, but writing skills. Another example, this is from an assessment from the math section of the Virginia Department of Education website. You will be receiving this presentation not long after the close of our next edition of it tomorrow. And when you receive that, all these images are linked. So if you click on either of these 2 images in the presentation, it'll take you straight to a page on the math website for VDOE that gives these rich mathematical tasks. And these are tasks that are designed to have students practice these very specific math skills in a context that allows them to communicate them and use them to spur action or to call for change or for something in their community. So this very simple task that you see pictured here, asking students to plan a dog park given a very specific set of parameters. So this already they're getting a chance to practice their math skills. They're encountering terms like area and square and rectangle and dimensions, so that they're encountering all this discipline-specific vocabulary and applying that to this task that exists specifically on this piece of paper. So once they've done that, you could stop, and that could be a really powerful learning opportunity. But then asking students to take what they've done, take those skills that they've developed, that vocabulary that they've developed, that you've been very intentional about directing their attention to, and create their own design challenge. That second picture there is of a disc golf course. Thinking just about, okay, we have this amount of land, we'd like to design this amenity for our Parks and Recreation department. And maybe they'll land on disc golf course, as I would, or maybe they'll think about like a skate park or basketball courts. But regardless, they're taking their math skills, applying them to a new problem, using that vocabulary, and then once they've done that, communicating what they've done, communicating that product to the outside world, and thereby getting another chance to practice that writing and another chance to practice that vocabulary. And then finally, thinking about history, using local topics is a great way to get at some of these more difficult history topics. If you've been to any of our history deeper learning work, you've heard us talk a lot about how do you teach hard history. And it's regardless of what level on which the hard history occurs, it's really important to tackle it. But sometimes for teachers, especially newer teachers or teachers who have never necessarily done this kind of thing before, tackling really difficult topics that are international and global and that lots of people know lots about can feel pretty daunting. But it's important to note, and this is a quote here from teachingtolerance.org, which is an organization that exists specifically to equip teachers with skills to help attack sort of harder history topics. They make a call for local history by saying, and I'll emphasize just this one piece, local history helps students better understand their community as well as the inequities they see around them every day. So you're equipping students to tackle hard history by looking in their own communities. And from a literacy perspective, this becomes a much, when students generate a final product around whatever local history you're having them analyze or having them assess, or even better, having them research, so you're practicing yet another transferable skill, you want them to be able to communicate that information out into the world. I've posted a great example, again, from my hometown that I just heard on public radio I think maybe a couple weeks ago, about an African-American school that existed in my community. I grew up having absolutely no idea that it had even existed. And recently, information has come to light through research that a lawsuit that helped open that school was one of the multiple impetuses for Brown versus Board of Education. And it's the kind of thing that I spent 13 years in public schools in that area, and we never encountered it. And it wasn't because it was being hidden. It was because local history was not something that that was necessarily emphasized, and for good reason. It's not something that fit necessarily into the standards. But if you think about teaching history as an opportunity to teach literacy, as an opportunity to practice literacy skills, then you can see the imperative to sort of tackle these local history topics. Not only are you working on research, but you're also working on vocabulary skills and writing skills. And if you needed, this is something that I like to tack on to any time I talk about interdisciplinary work. If you needed any other ammo for suggesting that it is important to build integrated work and to plan for interdisciplinary work for students, our guidelines surrounding the local alternative assessments. So that's third grade science, third grade history, fifth grade writing, U.S. History 1, U.S. History 2. The guidelines surrounding those alternative assessments encourage the development of local assessments that address content from multiple subject areas. So if you're looking just as a starting point for interdisciplinary type work or interdisciplinary planning, or even just having your teachers tackle these questions, planning something based around these guidelines might be the way to do that. Now, this is very specific work, so it's important to make sure that whatever resources you're grabbing to do this work, they're resources that are effective and that that you can sort of rely upon for being vetted. We do have several suggestions for where you might find resources for that work. The first, and this is something that for all topics local history is just a godsend, for lack of a better way to put it, but that's Encyclopedia of Virginia. It's in partnership with the Library of Virginia, which is a state agency, so it's something that is now and will remain totally free. It is written, most entries are written at roughly a sixth grade level, so it's something that you can imagine will be generally approachable for a pretty wide range of students. And you can sort and search by locality. So if you go into Encyclopedia Virginia and you search Bristol, Virginia, you get this amazing entry about Bristol as the birthplace of country music, and this awesome nonfiction passage about the Bristol sessions and how the Carter family came to Bristol and recorded this music, and it started this incredible pop culture movement. So that's something that isn't going to be embedded in our standards because it's a topic that's specific and local to Bristol, Virginia. But if you're a student who lives in or around Bristol, Virginia, or who is interested at all in country music, it's a topic that's going to be highly engaging if you're given the chance to investigate that topic. And Encyclopedia Virginia is a great place to go to for that sort of work. And then Common Lit. This is something that every time I'm given a chance to speak about anything, I make sure to point out commonlit.org if you're not already using it, something that English teachers, I think, are generally familiar with, but teachers in other content areas may not be. If you're thinking about being very intentional about literacy in your content area classroom, a good way just to incorporate something small, maybe it's just for a warm-up, is to go to commonlit.org and browse prose and poetry by theme. Maybe there is something in there that deals even just tangentially with a biology topic or a science topic or a math topic that puts students in the right frame of mind for the type of work they're going to be doing in that class. Common Lit allows you to search by theme, and it could be a really easy way to find passages that are now and will remain free and fit into a larger theme that you're tackling in your classroom. So certainly Common Lit allows you to sign, it asks you to sign up for an account, but after that you're in and you have access to all of their content. Another great way to do this, particularly if you're thinking about integrating science, history, and English, and then creating even math tasks surrounding this, is the National Geographic Geo-Inquiry process. The geo-inquiry process is not a specific resource as much as it's a pedagogical approach to having students think about just the idea of place, of either where they live or the place that they're studying. And it's driven by these big sort of inquiry-based models of instruction. So having students ask questions, collect research or data around that question, work with maps and geography to visualize that, create solutions, and then act upon those solutions. So geo-inquiry touches every single content area we have and can be sort of a ready-made approach for building what can at times seem like really daunting work. If you're thinking about incorporating 4 different content areas to build something, it can feel like a lot. But this geo-inquiry site offered by National Geographic has some geo-inquiries that have already been created, but it also offers training opportunities for teachers to get background in this model, and also gives you just pedagogical advice on how to incorporate this sort of work into your classrooms. All right, so that is all for today. I promised throughout the presentation that I would make sure to give you contact information for all the folks who you may have questions for as you build and tackle this sort of work in your classroom. Keep in mind that this is a very broad overview of some general strategies you may want to emphasize as you do this, but this does not mean that the conversation is over. If you'd like to talk specifically or bounce ideas off of one of us, we'd be more than happy to hear from you. It's fun work for us to do. So please don't hesitate to reach out. You see our email address is there. And we really thank you for your attendance today, and thank you for being involved, and welcome any feedback you may have. I'm going to, before I stop, turn things back over to Jill, if I can figure out how to do this on our audio. Let's see.
There we go. Thank you,
All right.
Taylor. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. If you didn't get a chance to join us this morning for our webinar with the PALS office, we encourage you to check that out. We will be repeating this webinar on Thursday, and then we have one more webinar which will conclude our series next week as we look at English language learners in the English classroom. So if you have the opportunity, please join us. Send the link to a friend. We will post these materials as soon as we can, but thank you, and we hope you have a wonderful afternoon.